The headline suggests a moment of political embarrassment. Lawmakers apparently shocked as if this were just another episode in Washington's endless cycle of outrage. But the truth is more sober and far more troubling because the evidence that emerged was not simply unexpected. It was prepared, preserved, and delivered with precision, and it reveals a strategic reality in the Middle East that the public narrative has carefully avoided. The media framed it as a sudden revelation. In institutional terms, this was not sudden at all. It was inevitable. And what made lawmakers uncomfortable was not the content itself, but the realization that the implications can no longer be dismissed as partisan talking points or speculative warnings. The story is not about shock, it is about exposure. And that's where this story actually begins. The new evidence presented to Congress was introduced as if it merely updated an ongoing situation. But its timing was deliberate, its structure unmistakable, and its purpose unmistakably clear. It was meant to shift the burden of responsibility. The document, part intelligence report, part diplomatic cable, part forensic reconstruction, was designed to undercut the claim that recent escalations in the Middle East were spontaneous responses by local actors. Instead, it showed preparation, not improvisation, not retaliation, but preparation. It demonstrated that the actors behind the recent Middle East escalation had been laying the groundwork for months, shaping information channels, coordinating messaging, and testing red lines long before the latest confrontation. The official narrative that these tensions flared up unpredictably collapses under the weight of these details. What Congress saw was not a moment of clarity. It was a moment of no longer being able to look away. And the uncomfortable truth is that several policymakers already knew portions of this information, but lacked either the institutional courage or the political incentive to acknowledge it publicly. The evidence dismantles the idea of an accident. It reveals design. There comes a point where political framing is no longer relevant because institutions, not personalities, bear the consequences. This is one of those points. The new material indicates that certain Middle Eastern actors cross boundaries that the United States has historically treated as inviolable. Boundaries related to territorial sovereignty, covert arms transfers, and proxy activation thresholds. These are not abstract concerns. These are foundations of international order. And this is where lines matter. Once a state or non-state actor demonstrates the ability to coordinate multiple theaters of pressure simultaneously, it challenges more than U.S. diplomacy. It challenges deterrence doctrine itself. At some point, institutions must respond, not out of political preference, but out of necessity. The Pentagon, the intelligence community, and the State Department cannot operate effectively if the assumptions underpinning risk assessment are quietly eroded. This is not theoretical. This is operational, and that is why the institutional discomfort is so acute right now. What lawmakers did not anticipate was who the evidence undermines, not adversaries, not foreign governments, not rogue militia, but one of Washington's own, a senior committee leader who had for months dismissed concerns about escalation as overstated, incomplete, or politically motivated. Someone with stature, experience, and institutional prestige. Someone whose resume had insulated them from serious scrutiny. But prestige becomes a liability when the record shows that early warnings were ignored, or worse, minimized, because they conflicted with preferred narratives. The blowback is not media outrage. It is formal, procedural, documented. Colleagues are not reacting emotionally, they are recalculating. When the first official statements came out, they were understated, almost deceptively calm. No dramatic accusations, no political theater, simply institutional language, ongoing assessment, review of intelligence discrepancies, need for interagency alignment. For many people, this sounded routine. For those who understand bureaucratic vocabulary, this was anything but routine. These are the phrases agencies use when they are laying the groundwork for corrective action, when the matter has moved beyond political debate and into the domain of process. The power shift here is subtle. The narrative is no longer controlled by elected officials. It is being reinterpreted by the institutions tasked with maintaining operational continuity. Media commentary may respond emotionally. Institutions do not. Once the evidence became public, those previously dismissive began offering explanations. Long, meandering interviews filled with qualifiers, appeals to authority, and repeated references to past service. This is a classic defensive posture, not the language of confidence, the language of insulation. Lengthy statements about decades of experience, deep regional knowledge, and long relationships with diplomatic partners were meant to reframe the issue as a misunderstanding rather than an error of judgment. But the tone betrayed something else, a quiet panic, because institutional scrutiny does not respond to resume padding, it responds to facts, and the facts no longer support the earlier claims of stability, restraint, or predictability in the region. Predictably, friendly media outlets shifted into a protective posture. They reframed the evidence as nuanced, complex, or misinterpreted by political opponents. They emphasized emotional narratives, personal hardship, dedication to public service, the stress of decision making under pressure. Sympathy replaced accountability. Instead of asking why core warnings were dismissed, the focus moved to whether criticism was unfair or politically motivated. But institutional reality does not bend to sympathy, nor does international conflict. When a region as volatile as the Middle East enters a phase of coordinated escalation, media reassurance becomes a form of misdirection. The stakes are not emotional, they are strategic. This incident is not isolated. It fits a larger pattern of institutional decay, where intelligence assessments are softened to avoid political consequences, where narrative replaces risk analysis, where early warnings are treated as inconveniences rather than responsibilities. We have seen this pattern before in missed terror warnings, in premature declarations of stability, in intelligence failures born from political discomfort. And it is increasingly characteristic of what critics describe as a deep state reflex: preserve institutional image at the cost of operational clarity. The Middle East has long been a test case for whether the U.S. political system can withstand uncomfortable truth. This moment feels different because the evidence is exhaustive and the consequences are immediate. The pattern is no longer abstract, it is actionable. The question is no longer whether the evidence is credible. It is, what obligations does it now trigger? Does the U.S. reassess its regional commitments? Does Congress impose new oversight on those who dismissed early warnings? Do institutions signal to allies and adversaries that neglected red lines will now be enforced? The fork in the road is unavoidable, and each direction carries consequences measured not in headlines but in strategy. The moment began with lawmakers shocked that the real shock is not the evidence itself. It is how long the signs were present and how determined some voices were to ignore them. The attempt to downplay growing tensions has now backfired. The narrative has collapsed under its own contradictions, and the institutions that were once differential are now quietly recalibrating, not because they want to, but because they must. In the end, this moment will be remembered not for the revelation, but for the reluctance to acknowledge it. A reminder that in geopolitics, ignoring a pattern does not erase it. It only delays the moment when it can no longer be denied.